What is your interpretation of TechnoWar? How do we get involved in Vietnam?
TechnoWar means you fight war as a production process. The military became deeply impressed with big business's contributions in World War II. After World War II, the military then decided that not only would the supply operations be organized along corporate lines, but that actual conduct of warfare would be organized along corporate lines. The officer corps were the managers, the enlisted men were the workers. The product was enemy body count. Just as American business prided itself on high technology, capital-intensive production systems, so too would our military have high technology, capital-intensive warfare to outproduce. We would kill more of them than they would of us. That's techno-war. Why was it applied in Vietnam? Because after World War, in the 50s, the Soviets had the atomic bomb. They could then destroy our economy or the base of our power if we intervened militarily in the world with too much force. The object then was to fight limited war for indefinitely in the third world. We would just send our production system over there and drive the other side bankrupt. Why Vietnam? Americans saw communism not as another type of social organization, as another culture, as another political system, but instead they saw Americans as the good, the natural, the godlike, and the communism was a foreign other, an alien kind of being. The world was divided into simply two types of people, communist and non-communist, and therefore it was like debit or credit, their side or our side. By the time the Vietnamese overthrew the French in the late 50s, we had our theory of limited war intact, we had our conventional forces ready to go. By the late 50s, Vietnam was simply a convenient place to test out this new theory of warfare, techno-war, and a place to drive the foreign other back.
In fact, you pointed out something fascinating in your book about how a major part of U.S. support at a certain part of the war was to win the hearts and the minds of the Vietnamese through importing U.S. commodities to them.
Yes.
And the U.S. government actually put up the money to import these commodities and created the whole infrastructure for it. And rather than winning the hearts and minds of the overwhelming majority of the Vietnamese people, it just created more corruption and inequality. Do you want to talk about that aspect of U.S. policy?
It's just hard for us to realize how much money was poured into that country in so many ways. If you were a high Vietnamese general or colonel in the South Vietnamese government, army positions were like business positions. And it was most American aid was for sale on the international market by the time it arrived. The level of theft is unbelievably high, and the only reason, it's like rather than try to control the theft, the American government essentially made the decision, look, theft by the officer corps is the price we have to pay for continuing the war. So therefore, in order that something reaches the Vietnamese people, we'll just send more and more and more. And there was an element of truth in that, but also the greater truth was that simply corruption became compounded and the riches became greater. We're talking about millions and millions upon hundreds of millions of dollars made, or even currency manipulation. Currency fraud was endemic. If you knew how to play the game, you could get rich simply by exchanging your money from dollars to piasters to military script and back again. You know, just nothing, just by playing with the rules a little bit. So, but it didn't. It created massive inflation. It meant that life for most people got worse. What were your jobs available while a few people on top were able to make money off this stealing the American aid? On the bottom, what were your jobs open for you? Well, you could work for the Americans. You could work on their base. You could be an interpreter, maybe if you had minimal language skills. These are all if you're a man. If you're a woman, the estimates are that there are like 500,000 Vietnamese women engaged in some kind of commercial sex. Prostitution, massage parlors, however you want to call it, hooch girls. It's a whole multi-levered sexual marketplace.
Drugs is another major business factor.
Huge heroin importation coming from all places, coming from Laos. And the CIA was running a war in Laos with the Hills people and with the Laotian government. In order to buy the leaders of the Hills people and buy the Laotian government, they had to acquiesce to the heroin trade. tons of heroin were brought in on Air America planes and Vietnamese Air Force planes, were refined in Bangkok and other places and sold to U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. For orphans, what could you do? Shoe shine business wasn't something kids had to make money on the side. Shining shoes was life or death issue. Going through garbage dumps. You know, a very dismal life in this new urban Vietnam, not a consumer paradise.
And then the other hand, you had the black market, where, as you say in your book, you could buy anything. You could even buy tanks, armored personnel carriers, and of course the Viet Cong were tapping into this.
Vietnam could equip themselves whenever they needed American goods. They could equip themselves without any problem. Yeah.
The other aspect of U.S. policy was air war. Part of your most brilliant chapters and descriptions in your book are of the magnitude and nature of the air war in Vietnam that was mainly, I guess, directed against North Vietnam. Do you want to discuss some elements of air war?
If war is a factory, then clearly when you look at air war, we've got the biggest factory and they have nothing. By American reasoning, the North Vietnamese should have given up the day the first bombs dropped on North Vietnam, because they had such a small industrial apparatus, such a small number of bridges and things, that you would think they would have just given up. But they didn't. They were willing to sacrifice their industrial apparatus. They were willing to absorb massive casualties. And indeed, contrary to American mythology, where the Viet Cong were simply being totally supported from the North, roughly 80% of the supplies the Viet Cong used, and even the 80% of the supplies the NVA used, were raised in the South. A small number of supplies were sent south. It couldn't be stopped. No matter how hard the U.S. bombed, no matter how much it escalated its campaigns, no matter even after they closed the ports at Haiphong and started systematically bombing the railroad lines between China and Vietnam, it couldn't stop it. The number of supplies wasn't that great. On the other hand, the air war did mobilize the North Vietnamese people to a considerable degree. Everyone had a job of one kind or another, either repairing the railroads, repairing the roads, or taking over industry, or working in agriculture. So it mobilized and consolidated that society to carry on, much like the Nazi attack on Great Britain consolidated British morale in World War II.
But on the other hand, people used to say, well, we ought to bomb them back to the Stone Age, and we just practically did, didn't we?
Most people don't recognize that the United States Air Force and Navy dropped between 8 million and 15 million tons of bombs and rockets on Southeast Asia. In all of World War II, the United States dropped 2.1 million tons. So the minimum estimate then is about 4 times greater than World War II, and it goes up to almost 8 times greater than World War II. In Westmoreland's 1967 report, he has a target category summary. And the largest category in there after vehicles is buildings. When you listen to the reports of foreign observers on the ground, what they report is just about any modern stone or brick structure over over 1 story was hit. Because those were the only things that looked like targets. And in essence, a lot of those were churches, a lot of them were hospitals, a lot of them were schools. Yes, North Vietnam was bombed back to the Stone Age. There's no doubt about that.
But because they were not fighting a techno-war, that
it did cripple them.
Now, we saw in the previous program where this production and assembly line type of attitude resulted in the demand for body count for the land troops. In the air war, they also had production quotas, did they not?
And the organization of this was, the unit of measurement is called a sortie. That's 1 flight by 1 airplane. And Air Force squadrons, wings, Air Force, large units have rates of production that they are supposed to meet. The Navy and the Air Force and indeed were in competition with each other to see who could, quote, be the most productive. Therefore, the object was to fly as many missions as possible within a finite period of time, like a week or a month or whatever. So rather than pay attention to really what you were bombing, or to pay attention to the safest way to protect your pilots and the way to minimize civilian casualties, instead military war managers devised ways to maximize sortie rates and consequently entered into serious irrational behavior. They, like in ground war, where U.S. commander treated their own ground troops as expendable, higher command treated pilots as expendable. They would often be sent on missions on, say, looking for trucks in the middle of rainstorms when it's impossible to see trucks from because the ground, you know, you can't even see the ground when you're 500 feet above it. But that keeps the sortie rate high. Or also, say you're supposed to, you know it's raining over a given target and the target's clouded in, but you still send your planes up there every day, 5 days in a row by the exact same route in order so that, because that's simply, it's like a factory, you keep doing the same routine.